Gender representation in art has changed throughout time, so to create something truly androgynous, we first have to see what makes a viewer believe a form has a certain gender. This is by no means a comprehensive look throughout time, but is intended to give a foundation as to gender representation throughout some points in history. But what is gender exactly? The encyclopedia states that, quote, gender, other than a biological or physical determination of the sexes, is a cultural and social classification of masculinity and femininity. Gender presentations in art are the outcome of the cultural process of defining sexual and social identity. Unquote. One of the earliest examples of gender presentation can be found in the Paleolithic statuette depicting Venus and Willendorf. This statuette is supposed to depicted motherhood and fertility, which was a common female signifier in ancient depictions of gender relations. In male-dominated cultures, femininity was also shown through weakness, inferiority, and malevolence, while masculinity was shown through their opposites, power, superiority, and benevolence. The Mesopotamian deity Queen of the Night embodies the female sexual power and the asserted destructiveness that embodied the monolithic notion that was associated with women for ages around 1800 BCE. As we move into the classical art era, women become associated with depictions of passivity, beauty and domesticity, while men are again shown through their opposite qualities such as power, dominance, and social status. In the Middle Ages, we can see the ideal female attribute summed up in the depiction of the Virgin Mary in Toros Roslin's Christ's Nativity and the Adoration of the Shepherds. Mary shows her womanhood through the more spiritual concepts of chastity, humility, piety, repentance, and salvation. Later in the Renaissance, women were defined by attributes of their professions and social status, while women were conveyed through their beauty and social roles. Portrait of Simonetta Vespucci by Piero di Cosimo, though, also depict women in a way that remind the viewers that women, while beautiful, may also lead to temptation and lust, which is known as the vice of luxuria. Later in the 20th century, we see the emergence of the cross-gender figure in fashion designs. Works like those of Mexican artist Frida Kahlo testify to the growing effort to, quote, legitimize broader gender boundaries while being a statement of assertive femininity. Unquote. Now that we have looked at how female and male representations have looked, let's talk about androgyny. Androgynous figures are generally ones where sexual characteristics have been combined or styled and whose gender is uncertain. These androgynous figures appear in Egypt in some of their representations of the gods and goddess, as well as in Hindu deities. Some of their avatars exist as both sexes, and depictions show this. For example, the Shiva Ardhanasvara as seen now is split down the middle, and one side is masculine and one side is feminine. One of the more famous androgynous representations are the Western depictions of biblical angels who have no sex. Now let's get to gender representation in contemporary art practices. In Abstract Bodies by David Getzi states that most important precedent within modernist sculpture is Constantine Brancusi. Brancusi attempts to simplify form down to its most basic organic shapes. However, gender assignment is still a key concern for Brancusi, and he often assigns a fixed gender to his sculptures. For example, while the torso of a young boy on the left and the torso of a young girl on the right could be a number of things, Brancusi decided to label them. Many have stated that, quote, he successfully transcended gender. However, only when his idealism led him to non-human bodies, such as birds, for whom gender, at least for their human viewers, was less consequential. Unquote. This can be shown in his work including Adam and Eve, Leda, and Portrait of Princess X. Another person that stands out when talking about gender representation is Judith Butler. In her book, Bodies That Matter, she gives what Gordon Hall In his article, Object Lessons, calls a quote stunning materialist account of gender unquote. Butler uses the argument for a return to the notion of matter itself and to rethink the very terms with which we understand bodies as gendered to counter the distinction between sex and gender, or the distinction between the physicality of the bodies and the immaterial realm of our ideas about bodies. She argues that quote, there are not bodies first and then ideas about bodies unquote, but that quote, bodies are always also ideas about bodies unquote, in order to understand the gender bodies in the way that Butler is describing. We must shift our thinking so that bodies and their characteristics are not distinct from the immaterial, gender, identity and fantasy. In Primstaic Views by Sile Metzger and Kirsten Ringelberg, Butler is also brought up. In this article, Butler's ideas are brought up in regards to the social and economic constructions of the categories of gender. In regards to those two categories, Butler wants to quote casts the very idea of gender itself not as evidence of belonging to one sex or another, but as a performative apparatus that brings men and women into existence through particular, distinct, and often oppositional sets of socially coded signifiers. Unquote. The performative aspects of a transgender body is later brought up via the thoughts of J. Posser's Second Skins. In this work, Posser frames their idea of both the material body and the body images. The material body is that which physically exists, and the body image is that both projects these experiences to the world and creates new experiences for a transgender person through the responses their appearance inspires in others. Before we hop into the AI portion of this video, I want to talk about gender representation as important using an interview done with artist Jay Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum's Hidden Worlds work used Greek and Roman statuary as a mixed dataset so they could explore gender through the lens of computer vision. They stated that they wanted to be able to make an androgynous godlike figure for those of us who never got to see themselves realized as gods. After her GAN system was able to create a figure that put together gender markers. The works were sent through Ryan Kiro's neural storyteller to generate narrative passages. In a statement about her finished body of work, Rosenbaum stated that quote, "For me, as a non-binary artist, it was important that these works reflected non-binary gender. The narrative flips pronouns at random and causes a disconnect in the viewer as they hear pronouns that don't appear to fit. This echoes the disconnect we feel when misgendered. It also causes the viewer to question their pronoun assumptions and what meaning pronouns have." Unquote. This is why representing identities that do not exist on the binary is super important. Representation is empowering and can help raise awareness to society inequality. We can now move on to how we are doing when we cross gender identification with AI. AI identifier systems are applied to many areas such as social media and facial recognition. Deep learning is the basis of these algorithms and many others. These deep learning systems can be trained to perform tasks by being presented with many examples of scenarios, pictures, or objects that have already been labeled. While AIs can be taught to identify people's gender, they can only work on the gender binary and classify based on a person's appearance. The data used to train these systems is also very important. Systems that trained using more diverse images were better at gender identifying than systems that were trained on more limited data. Let's look at a study that took a crack at identifying gender based on photos. In a study done by the Pew Research Center, the system that was trained with the most diverse set-out data was about to identify a picture's gender accurately 87% of the time, whereas the other 6 ranged between 74% and 82%. Generally, these systems had a harder time identifying women. However, these systems are so complex that the scientists were unable to understand why. So why is it so hard to classify a photo if there are only 2 options? Let's try to classify some ourselves. First, we are shown an image of a face that has been labeled based on the gender binary. The system then tries to make an initial guess, which is sometimes wrong. We are then given a set of boxes containing features that we can conceal on the AI in an attempt to make it change its categorization. I will be choosing randomly. Once we have chosen the right one, we are shown the areas that, if concealed, change the AI's gender categorization of that particular image. There are 5 images we are given to test. I will now run through them all. Now looking at all of the photos together, we notice that there isn't a pattern to the colored boxes. This is because the system's analysis of each face gives it a different answer in a different part of the face that, if it disappears, will make it change its mind. Another layer of difficulty is added when we realize that the areas highlighted don't always make sense. We have looked at many different gender representations but not many truly androgynous ones. Is it possible to be able to classify a truly androgynous face via AI since we cannot tell someone's identity just by looking at them? Since androgyny has a different definition for everyone. Do you think we can even make a truly androgynous figure without leading the viewer to that conclusion?